It's the week ending Saturday, the 1st of July, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen the Wagner group of mercenaries withdrawing from Russia under a deal announced by the Kremlin, Prince William announcing plans to cut homelessness in the UK, and Madonna postponing her world tour after a spell in intensive care. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the Week's digital team is Jamie Timson, from the Week Junior, Felicity Capon, and from Daily History Show Today in History with the Retrospectors, Arion McNicoll. Three panellists who first appeared on the show together as a trio on episode 44 in November 2017, apparently.
The golden days.
What were the subjects?
Good question, Jamie. Would you like to guess?
Oh, great. What would I like to guess? Was it
some calamity that was going to emerge 10 years hence and just really hasn't?
Yeah.
Yes, that would be, is Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman agitating for war in Lebanon? Also, we discussed, will Trumpism be defeated by the LGBTQ community? I'd say no.
No.
And can a new editor bring Vogue back in vogue?
Oh.
To which I'd say yes, probably yes.
Oh, yeah,
That'd go quite well, didn't it? Anyway, Jamie, like Miriam Margolyes gracing the cover of an austere publication, you are up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This was the week progressives across Europe asked, who's left?
The serious issue is the lament of the Greek left tonight. Because we failed. We failed on two grounds. We failed to convert the 10-year, 12, 13-year massive resistance of the Greek people against the austerity from the Troika, from the European Union, from the local oligarchy, into a progressive front. And we also failed to prevent the conversion of the rage of the population into a right-wing, ultra-right-wing, racist wing.
Yanis Varoufakis speaking to Democracy in Europe Movement 2025 on Monday. You can see the whole video on their social media channels. So, Jamie, there was an election in Greece. What's happened?
Yeah, so over the weekend, there was an election in Greece, and it was a bit of a shock for the kind of traditional elite, I guess, in Greece, or the kind of traditional media. Not necessarily because Kyriakos Mitsotakis' New Democracy Party won, although it was a surprise that they had twice the percentage of the vote that the main opposition, Syriza, got. But also a bit of a shock because a far-right group called the Spartans became the fifth largest party. And they were previously an unheard of political force who basically managed to win some votes with the help of an imprisoned neo-Nazi leader of the now disbanded Golden Dawn Party. But the reason that I'm bringing this to the table today is because it's actually quite representative of the kind of demise of the radical left. I mentioned Syriza earlier, and Syriza, for people that don't remember or perhaps are too young even to recall, they ruled the country from 2015 to 2019. They kind of started up as quite a radical left-wing party and almost as a kind of direct opposition and result of the austerity that had to be enacted in Greece at the behest of the EU. But they now seem to have been completely decimated. And when we look across Europe, radical parties on the left are seemingly facing a bit of an existential crisis. There's been a fair amount of election defeats, but Spain is a good one to highlight as well, where they're about to have a snap election next month, where it looks like the ruling left coalition will potentially lose. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm bringing to the table the question, is this it for the radical left? It's all over.
Do you think it's all over, Felicity? Because it does seem, doesn't it, that with rising inflation and the cost of living crisis and concerns around the climate, these are the kind of issues that those kinds of parties usually do well on.
Yeah, I mean, I think it will certainly prompt a lot of soul searching amongst the left. I mean, like across the board, when you look at Italy, even Sweden, Germany and France are in trouble. it's almost ironic that the UK, who voted for Brexit, actually seem to be the only ones who are kind of on course potentially to have a Labour left government who could come into power, which is very ironic. But for me, I don't think it's a right versus left argument anyway. I think it's a globalism versus populism thing.
Expand.
Well, populism and populist leaders are growing in popularity.
Populism is becoming increasingly popular.
Popular. And this is a backlash to globalism, basically, and the failures of globalism. I think there's definitely a rise in the kind of politics that is characterized by sovereignty and identity and patriotism, and a backlash against immigration. I mean, immigration seems to be the big thing, one of the big deciding factors in the Greek elections. Syriza and Tsipras, they had really no clear position on issues such as a border fence at Evros, whereas Mitsotakis, he had campaigned heavily on his firm but fair migration policy. And there's no doubt that, for example, Merkel's whole open the gates to Syrian refugees has been a huge issue in Germany, huge issue in Sweden. And basically, I think it's a lot of working class people who don't feel that they've been heard or listened to for the last few years. I think that left and right politicians are kind of all the same. I don't really think it's about that. And I think increasingly people are turning away from that and turning to more populist leaders. What I would say is that I do think there's a lot of hand wringing about this, and a lot of despair, and what's happening on the continent is a terrible thing, and actually it's not like military coups are happening left, right, and centre. This is still democracy. This is democracy in action. So yeah.
But then if it is, Arion, about people feeling they're not being listened to, working class people feeling their concerns aren't being listened to, it does just seem, just on paper, it does just seem a bit bizarre that they'd then re-elect someone like this chap in Greece who kind of comes to power talking about, bankers rather than the daily lives of the people who are voting.
Yes, I mean, I think in the case of Mitsotakis, he did survive these recent scandals, including the revelation quite recently about the fact that his party had been wiretapping senior politicians and journalists. And then there was this deadly train crash on February the 28th that exposed this poor safety measures across public transport. But even so, voters broadly seemed happy to return him to power because he had been delivering economic growth and lowering unemployment. And I think that's the sort of stuff that is, in his case at least, what resonated. I think that the business of populism is what explains the rise of the Spartans, who Jamie mentioned, and then these other really far-right parties within Greece, the Niki party, which is this ultra-Orthodox pro-Russia party that really had no sort of presence just before the first of the two elections. There was one in May that didn't return a clear majority, and so this was kind of a redux, and now we have a clear majority that's emerged. But I think that really, the rise of those parties and the simultaneous decline of the left is the thing that I suppose Felicity is talking about, this ongoing appeal of populism that's not just talking to people's pockets, which I think is, continues to be like a primary motivator when people go to elections. But there's something deeper that's been going on, and that probably is some of this ongoing, lingering concern about globalism and its effects.
And immigration, as Felicity said. I mean, Jamie, how much do you think this is really about immigration? And when people feel their country is unfairly burdened with migrants, they don't tend to vote for left-wing parties.
Yeah, I think it is a huge part. To take another example, in Germany, actually this week, Alternative for Deutschland, which is the right-wing party, anti-immigration party, they won their first election. It was a local district in Germany. And the first thing that the party said is that we're going to put a stop to refugees coming into this district. And so, yeah, I think that's right. I think there are probably a couple more issues. Really, if you look at it, it's the classic age-old thing of, Judean People's Front of Judea, in the sense that a lot of the left is very fragmented still. And even in the places where there is a kind of coalition, like in France, where there's a kind of left-wing coalition that are kind of main opposition to Macron, that's led by Mélenchon, who has a kind of similar profile to someone like Jeremy Corbyn did, that even when there's a coalition, they're so fragmented on some of their beliefs that it's hard for that to really succeed. And so I think there's that issue that maybe causes a problem. I think also a lot of what happened with the new parties like Podemos and Syriza and even like Momentum and Jeremy Corbyn in the UK was that they were movements kind of underpinned by youth and young people and kind of mass youth radicalization. And it felt like for a period of time that there were young people wanting to take part in politics and get control of it. The fact that maybe not so much has changed and that unfortunately the pandemic, I think, probably put a big stop to a lot of the change that could have been possible. And we see, less space for a kind of massive debate about state intervention, because actually everyone's just decided we do need state intervention now. I just do feel like there's less of a youth kind of movement in Europe at the moment. And that's not, unfortunately, that's resulted in a situation where the parties that maybe don't care so much about young people, the maybe far right parties that are able to mobilize their voters a bit more strongly have won out.
And what about the Green parties, Felicity? Because that's an area where it does seem that there's traction, but they've faced some issues in Germany too, haven't they?
Yeah, I mean, issues to do with green policies and energy in Germany, I think that's probably as big a problem as migration, because I think there's all this talk about wanting to replace people's boilers and have all these green things, and then loads of people are up in arms about that. And I think that's one of the problems certainly that Germany's facing. I just think the youth is I do think it's really sad that the youth did seem to be really fired up politically at one time, and that does seem to have gone away. I do think there's this kind of apathy and disillusionment that has just taken hold, that they sort of just don't want to get involved really on either side so much. But I do attribute that to the fact that there seems to be increasingly not much distinction between the left and the right anymore. And I think the pandemic definitely showed that on things like state intervention, when you look at Rishi Sunak rolling out the whole furlough scheme, I mean, I can't think of a more example that shows that is a Conservative government acting as though it was a leftist government. So I wonder whether there's a sort of it's a bit of a mess out there, and as a result, the parties on either side are getting pushed more to the far right and the far left as a result.
But maybe that's because we feel fragile. We've seen the impact of world events on us. And it's back to what you were saying, Arion, of, in a sense, people are voting more for who seems a safe pair of hands. And that is what we're seeing in the UK, isn't it? Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer both saying, regardless of politics almost, I would be the safer steward for the economy. Starmer obviously having the edge because, it was under Liz Truss that the economy crashed. But nonetheless, that's the game they're playing, isn't it? Trust me.
Yeah, totally. And I think there's kind of two key ways that you get into power. One is by presenting a really exciting agenda of political ideas. And the other is by putting your head below the parapets and hoping that the party in power kind of self-immolates. And that, has been the strategy to some extent of Keir Starmer, as opposed to what Corbynism was about, which was very much a kind of a very, pro-leftist agenda that tied in quite nicely with, what Syriza, on the face of it, promised to represent. I mean, coming back to Syriza, I think it's quite interesting to consider its decline in light of what the party became in office. When he was elected, Alex Tsipras said, this is the quote in his sort of speech after the win, "Greece leaves behind catastrophic austerity. It leaves behind fear and authoritarianism. It leaves behind 5 years of humiliation and anguish." But then in the years that followed, he really tried quite desperately to endear himself to the exact establishment that he once pledged to fight. And he was sort of protecting and cozying up to the old oligarchs and ushering in a generation of new ones. And also, he did then implement these austerity measures that were so brutal that even Germany's finance minister, Wolfgang Schäuble, accused him of putting the burden on the weak. So, for all of its pledges and promises, I think that what happened to it once it came into power really, it demonstrated this great change. And so it's no wonder, at least for the young people who believed in what Syriza represented prior to their election, that they felt disenchanted with it after they came to power.
I think as well, the pragmatism angle of it, of basically wondering what would happen if the left came into power anyway, and would they end up having to be pragmatic? and whether or not then it loses its luster. You can kind of see that in, I mean, we were just talking about Germany, but, you know, the Greens have come into power there in 2021, and they've faced massive problems coming up against Green activists, basically Green activists saying, you guys you're being too pragmatic. There was a whole dispute over an opening of a mine. And actually, the question maybe will end up being, particularly if the left does have to and potentially will coalesce around an ecological argument, how much are, you know, environmental activists going to be willing to accept pragmatism if it means that climate policy is changing quickly enough? I do see probably it ending up in a situation where you have one set of, across Europe, one set of politicians who are climate change focused, and another that are very anti it. And unfortunately, I think quite a lot of politics will coalesce around that as we move forward.
Okay. Felicity, you're up next after this. Okay, just a warning that our next story is about abortion and child mortality. Felicity, what do you think this week should be remembered for?
This week will be remembered for a moral dilemma that refuses to die.
What I will say, and I always worry when we talk about abortion, is I think we often, as a country, act like we're little America, and we sort of import America's fights. And obviously America have a much bigger fight on their hands when it comes to abortion rights than we do. And I sometimes worry that by importing that fight a bit, we almost open it up as more of a discussion than it has to be. This is a settled debate in this country. People, if you poll them, believe in the right to abortion.
Times Radio's political correspondent Charlotte Ivers on BBC's Question Time earlier this month. So Felicity, abortion rights, although that's not quite what's happened this week, is it? Give us the background to events right now.
It's not. This is not the most cheerful of stories, but this is about a teenager who called Paris Mayo, who's 19. When she was 15, she gave birth to a baby who she then killed within a couple of hours of it being alive. And this year, a jury found her guilty of murder, and she'll spend at least 12 years in prison for the crime.
And I mean, you know, we've given a trigger warning. I mean, I don't want to go into all the grisly details, but just a little bit more to give us a sense of what happened here. She gave birth in her parents' home without making a noise, right? Because she didn't want them to know she was giving birth. And then she essentially, from the moment the child was born, appears to have murdered it in the most horrific and violent ways. Him, I should say, murdered him.
Yeah, it was by all accounts a violent murder. It is extraordinary that she gave birth completely alone and in silence, despite suffering terrible labour pains. She was very worried about what her parents would think. She claims she didn't realise she was pregnant. This was disputed by the judge, but she had quite a difficult background. She slept with boys to make herself feel better about herself. The father of the baby didn't want her to wear a condom, so she didn't. It's a stupid mistake that has had absolutely terrible consequences.
So how does this link into abortion? There's another part to this story you'd like to bring to our attention.
Yeah, I couldn't help but link this story to a story from a couple of weeks ago about a woman called Carla Foster, who was 44, and she procured some abortion pills and caused her own miscarriage by taking these abortion pills when she was in her 8th month of pregnancy. And actually, when I thought about the age of the fetus and the age of Paris Mayo's baby, there could only have been a few weeks between the two. And yet I felt the treatment of both stories was quite considerably different, in that in the case of Carla Foster, there was a huge outcry, a huge outpouring of sympathy for Foster, that she had to go to prison for a few months, I think. And she already had 3 kids who she's, now going to have to leave these kids behind while she serves this prison sentence.
The sentence is 28 months. Obviously, she may not serve all of it, yeah.
And it was very much on her rights as a mother and her reproductive rights and her right to abortion, even though it was 8 months, which is, very, very late, and a crime in the UK. Anything beyond 24 weeks is a crime, except in exceptional circumstances. And with Paris Mayo, the focus on, when you read the judge's comments, it's all about the baby, and it's the most appalling thing to have happened to this baby, and the one person this baby should have been able to trust, its mother.
But doesn't really mention the context of adults that may have let her down around her.
Sure. And I mean, it's hard not to feel like enormous sympathy for both women involved, really. I feel like having gone through what they both went through is sort of a punishment enough, maybe. But I do think it shows that we are in a bit of a muddle about how we feel about this very sensitive, contentious topic.
I mean, if you take prison out of it, Arion, as the punishment, the fact that there should be, from society, a punishment in both instances, even if that was, some form of compulsory therapy, some form of rehabilitation, that doesn't feel inappropriate, does it, when you're talking about aborting a fetus that is completely viable at 8 months or killing a newborn baby? They're both things where you can say there's a reason why in law those things are illegal and they should be punished somehow.
I suppose even calling it punishment demonstrates a limit to the amount of understanding that we might want to extend to both of these women in their particular cases, which I do feel are linked by the enormous stress that both of those women would have been under that led them to make the decisions that they did. And we've heard a little bit about Mayo's case, but when it actually went to trial, the jury was actually instructed by the judge to consider whether she was of sound mind when she did the act, in which case it would be murder, or not, in which case it would be this sort of lesser crime of infanticide, which implies diminished responsibility. That's actually a thing that comes from the 1922 Infanticide Act, which was brought about to legally differentiate between infanticide as a sort of manslaughter versus, the pure act of murder. And it was introduced to try to recognize the particular socioeconomic stresses that could lead particularly unmarried women at the time to kill their illegitimate newborn children. That was all of the sort of context of the time. But you can see how trying to apply that same sense of sympathetic understanding to someone who's done something that, obviously is very difficult to hear about, but to try to think about what brought her to that situation seems like the least we can do. And so in answer to your question, should there be a punishment? Perhaps there should be some sort of consequence, but I'm not sure that even using the word punishment is quite the right thing in this case.
Well, I mean, there's a question about whether using the laws is the right thing in this case, Jamie, in both these cases, because as Arion just outlined, infanticide is a fairly ancient law, although you can see how it can be adapted to reflect modern understandings of postpartum depression, etc. But also the abortion law itself, extraordinarily, the one that eventually sent Carla Foster to prison, was over 160 years old.
Yeah, and I mean, so it was the Offences Against the Person Act, which is from 1861. The kind of barrister involved called the act ancient, and was written at a time when women didn't even have the right to vote. A lot of the campaigners kind of point to the fact that, if we're going to have abortion as illegal, if it isn't legal and it isn't free at the point of delivery, then people tend to go on later and leave it and can't access services. We kind of forget, we maybe think about what you or I or someone of kind of an educated, privileged background, how they would react to things. And they think, okay, this whatever accident or however you want to view it has happened. I need to go and take these processes. A lot of people aren't educated to know what to do in that situation. And if they see that it's not legal, and certainly if you see some of the punishments that are handed down, I mean, I don't feel like what happened to Paris Mayo is going to work as a kind of a warning to people. It's just actually going to scare teenagers more and more. And, when Arion talked about infanticide, it's interesting to point out that the jury basically didn't feel like Paris Mayo was disturbed in terms of the balance of her mind, and so they couldn't justify a verdict of infanticide. And when you read the judge's comments, they are working from a basis of what the law says, and they're acting on the law. So I kind of have less of an issue with the judge and more about maybe an issue of the society in the context. What's happening to the father of this baby, who should take more responsibility in the child's life, and then also to her parents. Her dad passed away, but is described as, I think it's emotionally cruel, or could be emotionally cruel at times. If someone is going to be punished, perhaps there should be a kind of punishment in the round rather than individually on this one girl.
Or, yeah, perhaps some societal focus on the fathers involved in this, Felicity, because obviously in both cases of these pregnancies, men were involved at the crucial stage of conception. There's no evidence in either case that a man was involved either to plot to abort an advanced fetus or indeed the infanticide. So we should underline that. There's no suggestion that the fathers, were involved in a conspiracy to do that. But the point is that the fact that these women were alone without the fathers to make those decisions is partly the responsibility of the father as well.
Yeah, I think we sort of forget that it takes two to create a baby, and yet it always comes back to women and a women's issue. And actually, I think it'd be great to have more of a responsibility, as Jamie was saying, and more of a recognition of, especially in Paris Mayor's case, the fact that, this bloke didn't want to wear a condom. I mean, that just... it's a tale as old as time, really, but it always comes down to the woman, really, and she's always the one sort of punished, or, if she has the baby and there's no support, all that sort of thing. I think it's also it sort of shows where we've got to in this country, though, with abortion. I think we're sort of in a bit of a muddle, because when I was reflecting on it, I sort of feel like we're both a pro-abortion country and an anti-abortion country at the same time, because up until 24 weeks, we're pro-abortion and you can procure an abortion. And actually, when I was looking at the statistics, most abortions happen within, I think, the first 17 weeks. They don't actually get as far as 24 weeks, because even at 24 weeks, there is some debate about whether that's actually too late. But then sort of beyond this deadline of 24 weeks, it becomes a crime. And, in some ways, if that's how we feel as a country, that it is a crime, and I can see why a lot of people, feel that it should be, because beyond that point, the fetus can survive outside of the mother's womb. Then if it's a crime, there has to be sanctions, but it's more a question of what those sanctions should be. And I think the infanticide point is really, really interesting, because actually up until this case, in similar horrible stories like this one, the jury has found the woman more likely to be guilty of infanticide, and that has resulted in a community sentence or a hospital order. So it seems sort of unusual and slightly harsher that there is more, women now being, going to prison for this.
Why do you think that was, though? I mean, it struck me that it was probably that brutality of the murder in question.
I agree. I think it is. And I think, I think what she did, I do think it was a terrible thing. And I sort of feel, I'm torn, because I feel enormous sympathy, and I can also accept that was a terrible thing to have done, and she shouldn't have done it. It just seems bizarre. It just seems a bit random and bizarre to me that actually if she'd had an abortion at 8 months, she would have got away, a lesser sentence. That just seems a bit random to me. I do think there needs to be a sanction or a penalty or something, but I'm just not sure this is the right way of going about it.
There were also, in Mayo's case, experts testifying as to her state of mind, looking at the sort of police camera footage taken immediately after the incident where they interviewed her. And one of the experts, who was brought by the defense, unsurprisingly, said that she was not of sound mind when she made this decision, and experts acting for the prosecution said the opposite. And, it really felt to me like one of those absolutely thankless cases for the jury where the judge did turn to them and say, you are being asked to rule on the state of mind that she was in, her mental state when she did this, and how could they possibly come to a sensible decision about whether this was murder or infanticide, considering the fact that they'd been presented with experts who said exactly polar opposite things. So, a little bit of sympathy for the jurors as well in what must have been an impossible case.
And some of the sort of lighter solutions, if you like, I'm not talking about these very complex issues of life and death, but some of the lighter solutions that get proposed when you're discussing this kind of territory, Felicity, are things like making sure contraception is more widely available, making sure that sexual education is extended into primary schools at an age-appropriate level and stuff. And all that is often contested by people that are fired up through polarized social media to oppose it. That's a problem as well.
Yeah, I mean, contraception, you could have a whole second podcast story on that. I feel like that's something that desperately needs to be addressed, because there just seems to be so kind of few good options for contraception for young girls and women. So yeah, I mean, I think that definitely has to be sorted, and I'm sure other factors like, the rise of extreme pornography and kids' access to the internet and all sorts of things all sort of probably need to also be drawn into this conversation. But I think it's very tempting to say this is a settled issue in this country, unlike in America. And I don't think that's the case at all. And I think these stories show that actually we're still in a bit of a moral quandary about how we feel about this issue.
Indeed. Okay, Arion, you're up next after this. Okay, Arion, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This week, we learnt that our growing obsession with keeping snakes as pets may be coming back to bite us.
A wise reptile keeper once told me that there are two types of snake owners out there. Those who have lost a snake at some point or another, and liars. Because honestly, everyone loses a snake at some point. It's just a matter of time until it happens to you.
What to do if your snake escapes. A YouTube video from Snake Discovery back in 2018. Worth saying, since you couldn't see it, obviously, that in the video format we were just watching, the lady that was talking just then was holding a snake next to her face while she was saying that, which I have a physical reaction to, and I suppose that's part of this story, Arion. What is it that's happened this week that's provoked your interest?
Yeah, so this week the RSPCA urged snake owners across the UK to be careful with their pets after a surge in the number of snakes that are escaping due to the hot weather. And the charity also released a list of the stray snake hotspots across Britain. We can go into that. I presume.
Go on.
Okay, right.
Give us number one. I mean, that's what we all need to know.
Yeah, Greater London, you'll be unsurprised to learn. It's kind of, it tends to hover around places with lots of people. This is part of the picture, which is that increasingly lots and lots more people are taking on snakes as pets. They're now up to 700 pet snakes across the UK, up from 500,000 last year. So a massive growth in the number of people who are keeping these animals in the first place. But the reason why warm weather is causing them to escape, and why the RSPCA is urging particularly owners of snakes to be vigilant, but people also to look out for them, is because during summer months, snakes just become more active and they crawl around more, and they're reputed to be very good escape artists, and they get out of their enclosures and make their way out into the world. So that's why now.
I suppose there is a risk to pets, isn't there, Felicity? That is actually a real concern, isn't it? If you have rabbits or mice or something, then you might be worried that someone's escaped pet snake might eat your pets. That's not great.
Yeah, that's not great. But just don't keep a snake as a pet, first and foremost. Why would you have one? I would never trust a person who had a pet snake.
Interesting.
I mean, that just screams.
Is that like on your dating profile?
100%.
Big cross.
100%. Also, I think it's cruel. I don't think any exotic pets should be kept in captivity. So I don't think you should have a snake. I was fairly happy to hear that they like to eat rats. And so I think there are loads of, might be making this up. Did I read somewhere 300 snakes live in Regent's Park now, and they like feasting on rats? And I was like, oh, well, that's okay. And if snakes and rats want to do some sort of mighty battle to the death, that's absolutely fine by me.
Okay, and for those of us who do feel a little bit queasy about this, Jamie, you can reassure us, can't you, that these snakes generally, the ones that are sold both as exotic pets and the snakes that are native to the UK, they don't really harm people?
No, I can't. Unfortunately.
Okay.
Terrifying. This whole thing. I don't like snakes. I can't imagine what it would be like if I was sitting in a park in Greater London and you saw one. But not only, while yes, a lot of them are a lot of the wild ones. Obviously, there are no native venomous, dangerous snakes to the UK, so a lot of the wild ones are fine. There has been a 94% increase in the number of venomous snakes kept in the UK. Since 2000, 94% increase. And so, and if it just gets warmer, basically, in order to own a venomous snake, all you need to do is you need to go and obtain a license from the wild animals licensee people, and then say to them that you know a way of keeping hold of, you're able to keep them in, and they go and check, and it seems fine. But that woman in that clip just said everyone loses a snake at some point. And so I just think...
No, but again, just to underline the question I was feeding you, I as far as I can tell, they generally eat mice. They don't eat people.
No.
So really, what's the problem apart from our squeamishness if you see a wild snake? Or does it matter if there's a snake that eats rats?
I think probably more of the problem is a sense of like, where does this lead to, and will it get out of control? And obviously, we don't want to be in a situation like snakes on a plane wise, where they're everywhere. Where they get on planes, they get into boats, cars. You don't want to be in that situation.
I mean, Arion, you are native to a nation that in itself has a lot of native snakes. So how do you feel about this? Do you think this is an overreaction in the UK?
Not necessarily. I think about 2 people die every year in Australia due to snake bites, and often what they're trying to do is to approach them to either subdue them and take them in or kill them. And I think that this is an important story, because if there are more snakes about the place, then people do have to know that it's worth not going anywhere near them. That's the same advice that the RSPCA and the Scottish SPCA advise, which is that you call their snake hotline. The numbers on the website. Simultaneously, there's an extra level to the story, which is that a lot of snakes, as well as just getting away, are being dumped because people have been taking them on as pets increasingly. But with the cost of living crisis, they're finding that they're very expensive and difficult to keep. And people, if they can't sustain them with the sort of lighting and heat that they require, are dumping them increasingly. So there is an animal cruelty story here as well. Not to mention the fact that even for owners of them, even before they have escaped, the whole business of more and more people keeping snakes has led to snake bite injuries becoming more common across the UK. And as Jamie says, if there's been this 94% increase in people owning venomous snakes, they need to be aware of that as well. So these aren't just sort of fun playthings to show to your children and get out at kids' parties. They're also actually real living creatures.
There is an answer, though, isn't there, Felicity? Back to what you were saying, why would you have one of these pets in the first place? In what Arion just said, you might have one of these pets in the first place because someone else doesn't want it. I mean, if you get your snake from a rescue centre and you're providing it at home and you make sure it doesn't escape, then actually, why can't it be an educational pet to have around children? It's a fun thing to watch, isn't it, if you don't have, as I say, mice in the house? I mean, I don't see why inherently it's problematic to own an exotic pet, especially if it's one that someone else didn't want.
Yeah, rescue snakes. Maybe. Maybe. It still doesn't warm my heart to think of them just in people's houses.
You can't take them to parks. I read that there was a big dispute in Paisley, so quite near to Glasgow actually, about a guy who was bringing his snakes to the local park to like sunbathe because they liked sunbathing, and he was like, it's fine, it's just a domestic snake. And then the council basically said no one has permission to bring snakes into the park.
I think even if you can rationalise it as this isn't going to kill me or it's not venomous or whatever, there is something like for a lot of people it's psychologically freaky. Snakes are just weird and they don't want to be around them, and I think that's fair enough.
And also, a few weeks ago on this podcast, we were talking about the continued decline of the red squirrel being replaced by interlopers like the grey squirrel. And this is a similar story. European grass snakes, which are commonly kept as pets in the UK, have started escaping and setting up colonies, particularly around Stoke and Yorkshire, apparently. And because they're quite closely related to grass snakes of a sort of native disposition, experts say that they are both hybridizing with them, but also could potentially both compromise their gene pool and come to replace or displace them within the ecosystem. So I think there are big questions about, and that's a snake that's very much like a snake that already exists here. What are the impacts?
But then just don't let them escape. I mean, aren't we talking about responsible pet ownership? Jamie, when
Listen
you talk
to the
about...
woman. Listen to the woman in the clip. She said specifically, everyone loses a snake at some point.
Yes, I know, but the public are squeamish maybe about snake bites in a way that they're not about dog bites, because most people like dogs, and yet, dog bites must be a lot more common. And they're tolerated in public parks in a way, aren't they? Dogs not on leads, for example.
Yes, maybe we do need to be a bit more accepting of exotic pets, but it's not a hill I'm prepared to die on.
Well, this is it. Okay, so let's just on that point, Felicity, as someone in power at the Week Junior Strings, when you next pull on those and you have to write an editorial about exotic pets, because that is something your readership are interested in, right? Is your message, don't get one, don't get an owl, don't get a snake, don't get a tarantula, get a kitten? Or is it that with responsible ownership
comes great power?
Great responsibility.
I think the line would be, do your research. Can you look after this thing? A snake is not just for Christmas, a snake is for life. I don't know how long they live for, actually. That's a terrifying thought. Sure, if you want an exotic animal, I'm not going to stand in your way, but you need to be responsible. You need to be able to look after it, and you need to make sure that you don't dump it, or that it doesn't escape.
And that's the advice as well of the British Veterinary Association, which basically is saying what you're saying, Felicity. It's sensible advice that you need to look into what it takes to, both take one of these animals into your home and also to maintain them, because they're, hopefully they are going to live a long and not too unhappy life. But also there is this trend of people looking at other people owning particularly cute, though exotic species online, things like otters and so-called bush babies, which, have these like posts on social media about them looking like sort of friendly creatures that have human-like feelings and behaviors and all of that. But actually, they come with serious requirements. And I think that people have to be sensitive to those. And it's exactly the same with snakes, that, they're both expensive to keep and also difficult to keep if you are going to be among those people who do manage to keep them in their cage in the first place.
On which note, we slither off into the sunset. My thanks to Arion, Felicity, and Jamie. You can follow this show for free and get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts and tap follow. You can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine with a trial subscription if you go to theweek.co.uk/subscribe. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.